Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this ReadyGamingTech.com video, I want to discuss with you some information that I've received for the successor to the Switch. Let's face it, the Switch has been a runaway success for Nintendo. Despite the fact that they kind of stumbled with the Wii U, the Switch has just really put them back on track for numerous reasons. The hybrid nature of the system is definitely a major win, but also it's the software library. Sure, you've got ports like Doom 2016, which is definitely nice to be able to play on the go, but really it's the first party and exclusive titles which really put the Switch on the map. Games like Mario Odyssey, Zelda, and so on are just all amazing quality. And clearly, the Switch is also quite unique in that it allows you to definitely be tempted to purchase it even if you have, let's say, a PS4. You could have a PS4, a PC, and still want to purchase a Switch, not only because of the on-the-go nature of the Switch, but also the library of games which are, well, unique to the Switch. I guess my point is that a successor to the system is inevitable. Recently, the president of Nintendo has gone on record and said no new Switch hardware in 2020. But given Sony as well as Microsoft are launching the successor to the PS4 and Xbox respectively in holiday 2020, it's just inevitable that Nintendo will want to also release new hardware and offer a more powerful device and better gaming experiences. So, to this end, one of my sources has reached out to me, and this actually I've somewhat verified with another source as well, regarding things that they've been hearing as whispers from Nintendo. Now, to my understanding, Nintendo have tested internally two possible successors to the Switch, two different variants of the hardware. The first was being tested last year, and then the second variant of the hardware was being tested in February. Now, what's really interesting about the hardware is apparently Nintendo have been testing the system to make sure that it's compatible with the Switch library of games. Now, just to be clear, I'm not 100% whether this is a Switch Pro, so let's say like the PS4 Pro or the Xbox One X, or whether it's an entirely new platform. So, of course, the difference there is that if it's like the Xbox Series X, for example, which is an entirely new platform, yes, it is compatible with Xbox One games, but Xbox One games will not be able to work on the older hardware. So I'm unsure which route Nintendo is going with this particular hardware. To my understanding, though, this is still rather early in the bring-up of the console. This is not Nintendo getting ready to send development kits out to, well, developers. And developers, from what I'm understanding, do not have access to these development kits yet. This is internal stuff. They are literally bringing up the hardware internally, and they are basically doing things like benchmarking it, testing it, especially the audio components. Now, the audio components of the Switch, the original model, were not quite what developers had hoped for. And there are some limitations with the original Switch hardware, which have been pretty well documented at this point. After all, it is essentially a variant of the Tegra architecture from Nvidia. And to this end, there are some limitations. Memory bandwidth is definitely one limitation, as well as CPU performance. And I was told something very interesting by one of my sources, and that is that originally, Nintendo had hoped to use a Pascal variant of the Tegra SoC, which would have been vastly more powerful than what we saw with Maxwell. And this particularly scuppered the audio capabilities. Basically, to my understanding, when they were originally testing with Pascal, they had hoped to push the audio components of the Switch considerably more than what they had, and this meant that when they started to port the audio samples and other things to the lower-end Maxwell SoC, it really caused a lot of problems, especially with performance, frame rates, and so on, so they had to basically redo some of this. To my understanding, though, this upgraded hardware has way better audio components, although I'm not certain exactly of the generation of Nvidia hardware which is being used. And yes, to be clear here, it is still Nvidia based, but it does seem, according to what I'm hearing, that there is slightly more customization put to this SoC compared to what we saw with previous, but I'm unsure and I'm unable to verify that precisely. So why was it that we saw Maxwell rather than Pascal? Well, it all comes down to cost, as you could probably guess. To my understanding, Nvidia and Nintendo just were not able to find common ground on the pricing of the Pascal SoC, and therefore Nintendo decided to go with the weaker hardware. I was actually given the price difference between the Pascal and Maxwell architectures, and I don't want to say what it was because I was asked not to, but all I can say is that the price difference was not substantial. Let's just say that. It was a very small difference between the Maxwell and the Pascal chips. So you can imagine, though, that if you're selling millions of units, this does start to add up. So if you're selling like 5 million switches, yeah, it starts to add up then. So ultimately, this did kind of hurt the capabilities of the machine. But now, obviously, manufacturing processes improved, architectures have improved. Nintendo feel more confident, most likely, to move on to a more powerful architecture. And yes, it's not just Maxwell with higher clock frequencies. I am damn certain that it is an upgraded architecture. So it's going to be interesting to see when this launches. To my understanding, this architecture, this bring up is not going to be ready by this year. Obviously, that's why the president himself has said that this is not happening this year. So it's probable it's going to be next year at the earliest that we see the successor to the Switch, or whether it's a Switch Pro. I think, honestly, that makes sense timeline-wise. By that point anyway, Nintendo won't be competing so much for sales from, let's say, Sony and Microsoft. Furthermore, for the next year, I think the developers will still be crafting experiences for the PS4, Xbox One, so those games can still be ported largely over to Nintendo. But anyway, ultimately, the Switch itself is just selling like hotcakes, and people will still want to buy it over the Christmas period. So what I'm basically saying is that if you were thinking of picking up a Switch and wondering whether you should just wait and pick up the Switch Pro or the, successor, whatever it ends up being, I would probably say just do it, because you're not going to see upgraded hardware released tomorrow, at least according to what I'm hearing from my sources. And as I said, I am pretty damn confident that the information that I've been told is legitimate. Ultimately, I can imagine that the next generation Switch is going to be, or whether it's going to be an entirely new console, is going to be way more powerful. And I was also told that audio allegedly is going to be a much bigger focus for this, which is kind of interesting, given obviously that the hardware itself is mobile focused. Although, of course, you could certainly get like a decent pair of surround sound headphones, and naturally you can also most likely run this in hybrid function, so you could plug it into like the dock and have an experience on your TV. So that's what I'm hearing. I would also be interested to see whether Nintendo do embrace a technology such as DLSS 2 for the Switch. Recently there was a job listing on LinkedIn with a developer being sought to basically improve and bring up a variety of different technologies for game consoles, and they were actually one of the things they gave as an example, something like DLSS 2. It does make me wonder if Nintendo would opt to enable this, because obviously it does increase the power utilization, but then again, you're also saving on the number of CUDA cores because you can upsample from a lower resolution, so it'll be fascinating to see how that was balanced. I also would expect that we don't get features like hardware-based ray tracing, even with an improved architecture, because at the end of the day, even if you have a console which is, let's say, 4 times more powerful than the Switch, I'm just using an example, I don't know the exact performance figures, you would assume that they would not want to put that onto a feature like hardware-based ray tracing, it would just eat up too much performance. With that said though, if you had a title that was running at, let's say, 540p, and then you upsampled that, let's say that the new system has a 1080p native screen, that actually works out extremely well, at least in my opinion. And let's just be totally honest, upsampling the resolution for games is going to be extremely important for the next generation consoles as a whole. Obviously, we've seen Microsoft really detail that with the Xbox Series X, which is using RDNA 2, so it's basically running the instructions on the same compute units that traditional graphics and compute workloads are running on. So it's not like Nvidia with the tensor cores. Instead, they're just basically running those instructions on either 4 or 8-bit instructions. So I would be curious to see whether Nintendo go with something like tensor cores, which would increase the power consumption, or whether somehow or another it's just running on the traditional CUDA cores, which, who knows? I mean, if they have customized the actual GPU any, which of course we don't really know 100% if they have or not, then that may be the route they decide to go. And also, if they do, let's say they did decide to use something like DLSS, it would also save things like memory bandwidth too, theoretically. So it's definitely going to be curious for the next generation hardware exactly what Nintendo does for their approach. And it also seems like, from what my source said too, there will be, of course, backwards compatibility with basically all Switch titles, which A, probably means it's still cartridge based, and B, is obviously great news for people who are either just getting into the Switch ecosystem or perhaps haven't bought a Switch. And it's also great for long-time Switch fans because obviously backwards compatibility is really important. And it also means that most likely Nintendo could really just do some a lot of marketing, push the console as hard as possible. And I wonder if they will slowly phase out the original Switch. So both will be on store shelves for a while, like we've seen their strategy with the Game Boy and the 3DS before, and basically we'll have both systems on the market, and then slowly phase out the original Switch. That would be an interesting, and to be honest with you, very Nintendo-like approach. Yeah, so this is just a smaller video. I wanted just to tackle this because I've been covering so much AMD information recently, so much Sony information. Definitely really happy that I've got something on Nintendo for once. But hopefully you've enjoyed the video. The normal stuff, if you did, like, share, comment and subscribe. I'll also say this is also an article. So if you do prefer the written version of information, then of course you can find it linked in the video description. With all of that said though, thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.